The gunmetal sky over the Wyoming territory had barely begun to gray with dawn when Silas Whitfield caught the girl with her hand buried wrist deep in his henhouse. 3 brown eggs cradled against her ribs like stolen gold, and a look in her eyes that told him she had not eaten a proper meal in longer than any soul should have to bear. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in redemption, and in the second chances that can change a broken life forever, I ask you to like, comment, share, and subscribe before we go on. Because what happened next between this weathered rancher and this starving stranger will stay with you long after the fire burns down. Silas had heard the henhouse door creak against the wind the way it always did when a fox or a raccoon came sniffing, and he grabbed his rifle more out of habit than alarm, expecting to put a scare into some 4-legged thief. Instead, he found a girl who could not have been more than 17, her dress torn at the hem and gray with trail dust, her hair matted beneath a man's felt hat 2 sizes too large, crouched among his hens with the desperate stillness of a creature who has learned that stillness sometimes means survival. She did not run. She could not run. He would learn later, because her legs had gone weak from 3 days without food, and the eggs in her hands were the first thing resembling a meal she had touched since a boarding house in Cheyenne had turned her out for want of coin. He lowered the rifle slow, the way a man does when he understands he is not looking at danger, but at desperation, and he asked her name in a voice that carried none of the fury she seemed to be bracing for. She told him it was Ruth Callahan, and when she said it, her chin lifted just slightly, some last ember of pride refusing to be smothered even here, even now, caught red-handed in another man's henhouse with his property clutched against her chest. Silas Whitfield was not a young man anymore. 43 years had carved deep lines into his face, and grief had carved deeper ones into whatever lay beneath it. For his wife Margaret had been taken by fever 6 winters past, and his only son had ridden east to the war and never ridden back. The ranch he worked alone now, nearly 400 head of cattle and not a soul to help him drive them, and loneliness had become as much a fixture of his days as the mountains that ringed his land. He could have marched her to the sheriff in town, could have let the law sort out what to do with a thief, and there were men in that country who would have done just that without a second thought, for the frontier was not gentle with those who took what did not belong to them. But Silas looked at her hands, trembling now not from fear but from hunger, and he looked at the egg she still had not managed to let go of, and something in him that had been asleep since Margaret's passing stirred awake. He told her to put the eggs in her apron rather than crush them in her fists, and then, in words that surprised him as much as they surprised her, he said that a henhouse thief made for poor eating and worse company, but a hired hand who knew how to work might find herself with a roof, 3 meals, and wages besides. He told her she could stay, if she was willing, and work for the eggs instead of stealing them. Ruth stared at him as though he had spoken in a tongue she did not know. She had learned, in the hard months since her father's death had left her orphaned and alone on the unforgiving plains, that kindness from strangers usually came with a price too steep to pay, and she asked him plainly what he wanted from her, her voice hard with a suspicion that no girl her age should have had to carry. Silas answered that he wanted an honest day's work for an honest day's wage, nothing more, and that the choice was hers to make. He told her about the fever that had taken his wife, about the war that had taken his boy, about the silence that had taken over his house and his heart in the years since. And he did not know why he told a stranger these things, except that something about her hollow, hunted eyes reminded him of his own reflection on the mornings he could hardly bear to look in the glass. She stayed, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because the alternative was another night in the open with nothing but a stolen coat and a colder wind coming down off the mountains, and even a stranger's uncertain kindness was better than the certainty of that. Silas gave her the small room off the kitchen that had once belonged to a hired girl years past, and he gave her Margaret's old work dress to wear until something better could be sewn, and though the dress hung loose on her thin frame, Ruth wore it like it was the finest garment she had ever owned, because it was clean, and it was given rather than taken, and there was a difference in that which she had almost forgotten existed in this hard world. The days that followed were not easy ones. Ranch work was punishing labor, even for men raised to it, and Ruth had never mucked a stall or hauled water or mended a fence line in her life, having been raised in a modest house in Missouri, where her father kept books for a mercantile, before consumption took him and left her with nothing but debts and a trunk of dresses she'd had to sell one by one just to eat. Her hands blistered and bled in the first weeks. She fell from the hayloft once and bruised her ribs so badly she could hardly breathe for 3 days. And still she rose each morning before the sun to feed the chickens she had once tried to rob, because something in her had decided that she would not be beholden to any man's charity, that she would earn every meal and every kindness twice over if that was what it took to hold her head up. Silas watched her with a quiet wonder he did not speak aloud. He saw in her the same stubborn grit that had carried him through the loss of his family and the burying of his dreams, and slowly, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, the silence of his house began to fill with something other than grief. Ruth hummed while she worked the churn. She asked him questions about the cattle, about the mountains, about the wife whose dresses she wore, and he found himself answering not with the clipped grief he'd offered other well-meaning neighbors over the years, but with something softer, something that felt almost like healing. In the evenings they sat on the porch while the sky burned orange and purple over the western ridge, and Silas taught her the names of the stars his own father had taught him. And Ruth taught him a hymn her mother used to sing before fever took her too, back when Ruth was still young enough to believe the world was kind. But the frontier rarely allowed peace to settle for long, and trouble came riding into Silas Whitfield's life the way it always seemed to in that hard country, without warning and without mercy. A man named Judge Harlan Boyce, who fancied himself the law and the gospel both in that stretch of territory, though he held no official office beyond what his money and his gunmen could buy him, had long coveted the water rights that ran through Silas's land, and he had made more than one offer to buy the ranch outright. Offers Silas had refused each time with the same quiet stubbornness that had kept him alive through every other loss. Boyce did not take refusal kindly. He sent word through his foreman, a thick-necked brute named Amos Fenwick, that Silas would regret his stubbornness before the season turned. And Silas, who had buried too much already to be frightened by threats, told Fenwick to relay to his employer that Whitfield land was not for sale at any price a man like Boyce could offer. It was Ruth who overheard the truth of what was coming. Working late one evening at the mercantile in town, where she had begun trading eggs and butter for coffee and thread, and she heard two of Boyce's riders speaking low about a plan to run cattle through Whitfield's fence line under cover of darkness, to trample his crops and scatter his herd, and make the ranch too costly to hold on to, so that Boyce might buy it for pennies once Silas was broken. She ran the 3 miles home in the dark without stopping, her lungs burning, her heart pounding harder from fear for Silas than from the exertion. And when she burst through his door and told him what she'd heard, he did not doubt her for a moment. For he had learned in these months that Ruth Callahan, whatever her past sins, did not lie. They had little time to prepare and fewer hands to prepare with, for Silas's nearest neighbors were miles distant, and a sheriff in town, a weary man named Otis Graham, who did his best in a territory too vast for one man's justice, could not promise riders in time to stop what was coming. Silas thought, in the darkest hour of that night, of simply letting it happen, of finally surrendering to the exhaustion of fighting alone against a man with more money and more guns than any honest rancher could match. But then he looked at Ruth, standing in his kitchen with flour still on her apron from the bread she'd been baking when the fear struck her, and he saw in her face the same refusal to be broken that had first caught his eye in the henhouse months before, and something in him remembered that he was not, after all, entirely alone anymore. They spent that night by lantern light rigging what defenses two determined people could manage, stringing extra wire along the weakest stretch of fence, moving the herd to the box canyon at the northern edge of the property where a narrow entrance could be more easily held, and Silas taught Ruth to load and fire the old rifle that had belonged to his father, her hands steadier on the stock than they had any right to be for a girl who mere months earlier had been too weak from hunger to run. From a henhouse. When Fenwick and his riders came thundering across the property line just before dawn, whooping and firing shots into the air to spook the herd, they found not the easy, undefended ranch they expected, but a rancher and a girl positioned at the canyon mouth, rifles raised, faces set with a resolve that gave even hardened men pause. Silas called out into the gray morning light that the first man to cross onto his land with intent to harm his herd would answer to him personally, and there was something in the flat certainty of his voice, forged by years of loss that had left him with nothing left to fear losing, that made Fenwick's riders hesitate. It was Ruth who fired the shot that ended the standoff without a drop of blood spilled. A single round scent whistling over the lead rider's hat that told them plainer than any words that these two would not be moved. And in the confusion that followed, with the herd already spooked and scattering in the wrong direction for Fenwick's purposes, the raid collapsed into disorder, and the riders wheeled and fled back toward Boyce's spread with nothing to show for their night's work but bruised pride. It should have ended there, but Boyce was not a man to accept defeat quietly, and word came 2 days later that he intended to press false charges of cattle theft against Silas through a magistrate friendly to his purse, a scheme that could have cost Silas not only his land but his freedom besides. It was Ruth again who found the courage that broke the scheme wide open, for in her months working the mercantile, she had befriended the telegraph operator's daughter, and through that friendship she learned that Boyce had wired instructions to his lawyer detailing the fabrication in his own hand, a piece of evidence that, once brought before Sheriff Graham, unraveled the judge's scheme entirely and left Boyce facing the very charges he had hoped to pin on an innocent man. Graham rode out personally to arrest Boyce's foreman for the attempted raid, and though Boyce himself slipped away to some other territory to work his corruption on softer ground, his hold over that stretch of Wyoming was broken for good, and the water rights and the piece of Whitfield land remained exactly where they belonged. In the weeks after the danger passed, something had shifted between Silas and Ruth that neither of them named aloud at first, though both felt it plainly enough in the comfortable silences that fell between them on the porch each evening, in the way Silas found himself watching for her return from town before he realized he was watching at all, in the way Ruth had stopped counting the days until she might move on to somewhere else, because somewhere else had stopped feeling like anywhere she wanted to be. It was Silas who finally spoke what neither had dared to before, standing in the same hen house where they had first met, the hens clucking softly around them in the amber light of a Wyoming evening, when he told her that the egg she'd once stolen out of desperation had somehow, without his ever intending it, led him to the first real happiness he'd known since he'd buried his wife, and that he did not want her to think of this place as merely a job any longer, but as a home, and himself not merely as an employer, but as a man who had come, slowly and honestly, to love her. Ruth wept then, not from sorrow, but from the astonishment of being loved without condition, without price, for the first time since her father's death had cast her out into a world that had shown her mostly its teeth. She told him that she had come to this land with nothing but a stolen coat and a stranger's cruelty ringing in her ears, and that he had given her not just bread and shelter, but her dignity back, piece by piece, until she hardly recognized the frightened girl who had once crouched trembling in his hen house. They were married that autumn in the small white chapel in town, with Sheriff Graham standing witness and half the county turning out for the celebration. For word of the rancher and the girl who had stood together against Boyce's corruption had traveled far in that close-knit territory, and folks who had once been strangers to them both came bearing gifts and good wishes for the second chance that had bloomed out of such unlikely beginnings. Years later, when their own children ran laughing through that same hen house, chasing hens for eggs of their own, Ruth would tell them the story of how their father had found her stealing in the dawn light with nothing left to lose, and how instead of punishment he had offered her a place to belong, and how that single act of mercy had changed the whole shape of her life, and, in time, changed his as well. She would tell them that the frontier was hard and often merciless, that hunger and loss and cruelty were as much a part of that country as the mountains themselves, but that kindness, when a person had the courage to offer it to a stranger who seemed to deserve it least, could take root in even the hardest ground and grow into something neither party could have imagined on the morning it began. Now, dear friends watching this story unfold, I would love to know where in the world you are watching from tonight, and what lesson this tale of Silas and Ruth has stirred in your own heart, whether it be the power of second chances, the quiet strength of kindness, or the faith that even our darkest hour might be leading us toward the very mercy we need most. Please share your thoughts below, for these stories grow richer with every voice that joins them. And if this story of a starving girl caught stealing eggs and a lonely cowboy who chose grace over judgment. Touch something tender in your heart tonight. I ask you one final time to like, comment, share, and subscribe so that more hearts weary from this hard world might find their way to a story of hope. For in the end, that is the truest lesson of the Old West and of every generation since, that redemption often arrives disguised as an ordinary morning, that second chances are born from the courage to extend mercy first, and that even the most broken among us are never truly beyond the reach of love.